The story of Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, is most often told through the lens of military triumph, political strategy, and enlightened monarchy, yet behind the legend lies a hidden youth marked by restlessness, forbidden passions, and an intellectual yearning that brought him into dangerous conflict with both his father and the world around him. To truly understand Frederick, one must look beyond the soldier king and consider the secret threads of his early life, where philosophy, music, forbidden companionships, and a fascination with Greek ideals shaped the mind of the ruler who would later alter the course of Europe. His Greek adventure was not one of swords and conquest, but of spirit and identity, where the ancient world inspired him to imagine a life that challenged the rigid norms of his own time. From the very beginning, Frederick's life was framed in tension between discipline and rebellion. Born in 1712 to Frederick William I, known as the Soldier King, he was raised in a household of severe austerity. His father despised frivolity, detested French culture, and demanded absolute obedience from his children. Young Frederick, however, was drawn irresistibly toward the opposite. He adored French language, read the works of Voltaire in secret, and studied Greek and Roman texts that presented models of beauty, liberty, and passion that contrasted sharply with the Prussian obsession with military rigidity. The boy who was meant to inherit a throne as a commander of soldiers instead began to dream of Athens and Sparta, of philosophers and poets, of a world where art, music, and even forbidden love could flourish. His heart leaned toward the classical, and that inclination would define the secret drama of his youth. Frederick's fascination with Greece went beyond academic study. In his imagination, ancient Greece represented a civilization where men sought honor, beauty, and love in ways that both inspired and unsettled him. The tales of Alexander and Hephaestion, the companionship of Achilles and Patroclus, and the lyrical poetry of Sappho all painted a world where passions outside the confines of convention had legitimacy. For a young prince trapped in the suffocating moral codes of early 18th century Prussia, these classical tales were more than historical curiosities. They were lifelines, visions of alternative ways to live and love. He found in them a justification for the desires and friendships that his father condemned. It was within this climate of repression and curiosity that Frederick forged an intense bond with Hans Hermann von Katt, a young officer who shared his interests in literature, music, and philosophy. Katt was not merely a companion. He was a mirror, someone who understood the secret yearnings that Frederick dared not express openly. Together they read forbidden books, played music, and dreamed of freedom beyond the harsh discipline of the Prussian court. Their friendship, tinged with deep emotional and perhaps romantic undertones, became a dangerous act of defiance in a world where his father demanded loyalty only to soldierly virtues. Theirs was a companionship that reflected the Greek ideal of intimate male friendship, blending intellectual exchange with profound affection. It was, in Frederick's eyes, his own forbidden Greek adventure brought into life. This bond, however, was destined for tragedy. Frederick William I was enraged by his son's resistance to becoming the kind of warrior king he envisioned. When Frederick, desperate to escape his father's tyranny, attempted to flee Prussia in 1730 with Katt's help, the plan failed. The young prince was arrested and brought back in chains. In a brutal display meant to break his spirit, Frederick was forced to witness the execution of Katt, his closest friend, who was beheaded before his very eyes. The trauma of that moment scarred him forever, embedding within him both grief and a hardened resolve. The Greek ideal of friendship had collided with the cruelty of absolute monarchy, and Frederick would carry the weight of that contradiction for the rest of his life. Yet even this tragedy could not extinguish his fascination with the intellectual and sensual dimensions of classical antiquity. If anything, it deepened them. Frederick turned more fervently to philosophy and the arts, creating a secret inner world that contrasted with the militaristic exterior he was forced to project. In his private writings and correspondence, he admired the philosophers of Greece and Rome, citing Socrates, Plato, and Epicurus. He idealized the pursuit of beauty, not only in thought but in human form, and he composed poems and essays that reflected desires he could never acknowledge publicly. His retreat into this intellectual and emotional sanctuary was his way of sustaining his Greek adventure even as the world demanded he become a Prussian king. The more Frederick grew, the more he embodied a paradox. On the one hand, he became the brilliant military commander remembered for victories at battles such as Leuthen and Rossbach, mastering strategy with an almost mathematical genius. On the other hand, he cultivated an aesthetic sensibility that owed more to Athens than Berlin. His palace of Sanssouci, constructed years later, was not a fortress but a temple of the arts, filled with music, philosophy, and conversation. He invited Voltaire to live there, surrounding himself with intellectuals who shared his passion for ideas. This tension between the martial and the philosophical, between the Prussian soldier and the Greek dreamer, defined his reign. But the secret heart of Frederick's youth, the forbidden side, remained largely hidden beneath layers of myth and statecraft. His contemporaries whispered about his relationships, noting his lack of interest in women and his deep, lifelong attachments to certain men. Rumors swirled about his sexuality, but in the 18th century such matters could not be openly declared. Instead, Frederick cloaked his passions in classical illusion, writing poems that echoed the voices of Greek poets who spoke of love between men in veiled yet unmistakable terms. His admiration for the ancients provided him with a language to express feelings that otherwise had no legitimate outlet in his society. In a sense, Frederick lived in two worlds. The public world demanded he be the embodiment of Prussian strength, leading armies and expanding territories. The private world, nourished by his youthful experiences, was one of art, philosophy, and forbidden love. The trauma of Kat's death haunted him, yet it also propelled him to construct a new identity. He never forgot that his Greek adventure, though secret, had been real, and in his heart he preserved the vision of a world where freedom of love and thought could exist. This duality made him one of the most complex monarchs of his age, a ruler who fought like a general but thought like a philosopher. The secret youth of Frederick the Great reveals the depth of human struggle between desire and duty, repression and freedom. His Greek adventure was not a literal journey to the Aegean, but a metaphorical voyage into the classical ideals that shaped his soul. In those ideals he found both solace and justification for the passions that defined his early life. Even as history remembers him as a king of steel and fire, his hidden story tells of a young man who dreamed of Greece, who loved in ways that were forbidden, and who carried the scars of that love until the end of his days. The Enlightenment would later crown Frederick as one of its monarchs, a ruler who corresponded with philosophers, tolerated different faiths, and saw himself as more than a mere king. Yet beneath this enlightened facade lived the wounded boy who once played the flute with Kat, who once dreamed of freedom under Greek skies, and who once stood broken as his companion was executed before his eyes. That memory shaped his compassion and his contradictions, reminding him always that the price of forbidden love in a world of iron was heavy indeed. As he grew older, Frederick continued to write poetry, often in French, a language his father despised but which connected him to the intellectual elite of Europe. In those writings, one hears echoes of Greek philosophy and the longing for a companionship that transcended mere politics. His poems, though rarely explicit, carried undertones that revealed his inner life, speaking in veiled terms of passion, loss, and the beauty of male friendship. It was as though the spirit of ancient Greece lived within his pen, allowing him to confess what he could never say directly. His life demonstrates the way that classical ideals could serve as both inspiration and shield. In invoking the Greeks, Frederick could both elevate his passions to the level of philosophy and disguise them beneath the cloak of antiquity. What might have been scandalous in modern terms became, through classical illusion, a matter of cultured refinement. In this way, the forbidden was given a language of legitimacy, and the private desires of a king could hide behind the respectability of ancient models. The contradictions of Frederick's character also reflected broader tensions in 18th century Europe. The Enlightenment was a time of reason, questioning, and the pursuit of knowledge, yet it was also constrained by old hierarchies and moral codes. Frederick embodied this duality. A man who pushed for religious tolerance and intellectual freedom, but who also ruled as an absolute monarch. His personal life, too, was shaped by this clash. His Greek adventure was a private rebellion against the limitations of his time, a rebellion that could never fully emerge into public view but that nevertheless shaped his thought and his reign. It is impossible to separate Frederick's achievements as king from the secret wounds of his youth. His obsession with discipline, his perfectionism, and his sometimes cold demeanor can all be traced to the trauma of his relationship with his father and the execution of Kat. Yet these very qualities also made him a formidable ruler. Paradoxically, the pain of his Greek adventure strengthened the very traits that enabled him to survive as king. The dreams of a freer world did not vanish, but they became sublimated into art, philosophy, and patronage. In his palaces, in his writings, and in his friendships, one can still see the flicker of that forbidden flame. The Secret Youth of Frederick the Great reveals a lesson about history itself, that the greatest figures are never simply what they appear on the surface. The King of Prussia, remembered for his armies and his reforms, was also a young man who once dreamed of forbidden love and Greek beauty, who suffered deeply for those dreams, and who carried them in silence for the rest of his days. His story reminds us that history is not only about battles and treaties, but also about hidden passions, private griefs, and the human need to seek meaning even in the face of repression. When we speak of Frederick's Greek adventure, we speak not of geography but of spirit. It was a journey into the world of classical ideals, into the beauty of philosophy and companionship, into the dangerous territory of love forbidden by his society. It was an adventure that left him scarred but also inspired, shaping the ruler he became. The Secret Youth of Frederick the Great is therefore not merely a footnote in history, but a key to understanding the complexity of a king who remains one of Europe's most fascinating figures. Even in death, Frederick's legacy reflects this duality. Buried at Sanssouci among his beloved dogs, not among the soldiers his father might have chosen, he left behind a symbol of his true self. Sanssouci, with its gardens and music, its philosophy and elegance, was his personal Athens, the Greece he never visited but always carried within. His life was a testament to the power of dreams, even forbidden ones, to shape destiny. The King of Prussia's forbidden Greek adventure remains a story not only of hidden youth but of the timeless struggle between desire and duty, love and repression, art and power. It is a reminder that even the greatest monarchs are shaped by secret longings, that behind every throne lies a human heart that beats with passions too dangerous for the world to know. In Frederick's case, those passions were inspired by the ancients, tempered by tragedy, and hidden beneath the armor of a king, yet they endure in the story of a life that was as much about the secret adventure of the soul as it was about the conquest of nations. 1. Frederick the Great's youth was marked by conflict with his authoritarian father, Frederick William I. From the moment Frederick was born, his life was shadowed by the immense expectations of his father, Frederick William I of Prussia, a monarch nicknamed the Soldier King. The father valued obedience, loyalty, and absolute conformity to military discipline. Frederick, however, was naturally drawn toward softer pursuits: languages, poetry, philosophy, and music. His father found these inclinations intolerable, branding them effeminate and unworthy of a future king. The conflict between father and son was not just a matter of preference but of identity. The young prince's desire for freedom and beauty clashed constantly with his father's obsession with duty and militarism. This created a climate of fear and repression in the royal household. Frederick William's punishments were often harsh, including beatings and public humiliations. Growing up under such tyranny planted within Frederick both resentment and determination, fueling his longing for an escape that would eventually define his youth. 2. His father valued discipline and militarism, while Frederick gravitated toward art, philosophy, and classical ideals. The Prussian court was essentially a barracks, where military drills and Spartan simplicity defined daily life. Frederick William despised extravagance, sophistication, and intellectual indulgence. Yet Frederick, delicate and sensitive, preferred to lose himself in music and literature. He played the flute with passion and studied works of philosophy, especially from France and the classical world. The divide between father and son grew ever wider, as one saw the future of Prussia in soldiers and muskets, while the other envisioned a realm where philosophy, reason, and art elevated society. Frederick's attraction to classical ideals was not an act of rebellion for its own sake, but a genuine reflection of his intellectual curiosity. He saw in Greek and Roman civilizations models of greatness that balanced warfare with culture. To him, the ancients represented a fuller vision of human achievement. His father, however, could see only weakness in such pursuits, deepening their rift. 3. Ancient Greece became Frederick's secret inspiration, offering a vision of beauty, freedom, and alternative forms of love. As a teenager, Frederick devoured Greek texts in secret, fascinated by the stories of gods, heroes, and philosophers. Ancient Greece, to him, was not merely history, it was a blueprint for a life beyond the suffocating rigidity of Prussian society. In Greek ideals he found liberty, freedom of thought, artistic expression, and even love that transcended conventional boundaries. Where his father demanded obedience and conformity, Greek culture celebrated individuality and inquiry. The stories of Socrates' search for truth, Plato's dialogues on love, and Homer's depictions of heroic bonds struck a chord with the young prince. More than just intellectual stimulation, these texts gave Frederick the courage to imagine a different life for himself. They hinted at a world where beauty, friendship, and passion were not condemned but revered. This secret devotion to Greece became his inner sanctuary, a place of escape and inspiration that sustained him during his darkest moments. 4. He admired Greek figures such as Alexander the Great, Achilles, and Patroclus, finding resonance in their companionships. Among the many figures of antiquity, Alexander the Great stood as both a warrior and a dreamer, a conqueror with a profound bond to his companion Hephaestion. Likewise, the epic partnership of Achilles and Patroclus in Homer's Iliad captivated Frederick's imagination. These stories were not merely tales of war but of deep companionship, intimacy, and loyalty between men. To Frederick, they mirrored his own longings for relationships that transcended the cold, transactional bonds of his father's militarized court. He saw in Alexander and Achilles models of courage balanced with tenderness, men who were both leaders and lovers of beauty. These figures validated his desires in ways his immediate world could not. By aligning himself with such legendary companionships, Frederick elevated his own secret passions into something noble and timeless, cloaked under the honor of classical heroism. In them, he found a mirror for his own inner conflicts and dreams. 5. Frederick's closest bond was with Hans Hermann von Katt, a young officer who shared his love of music and literature. Hans Hermann von Katt, a handsome and intellectual young officer, entered Frederick's life at a crucial time. Unlike many at court, Katt understood the prince's fascination with literature, philosophy, and especially music. They often played music together, Frederick on the flute and Katt accompanying him, creating a harmony that went beyond sound into emotional intimacy. Katt represented a companion who did not ridicule Frederick's sensibilities but celebrated them. Their conversations spanned philosophy, poetry, and dreams of freedom, making Katt a confidant unlike any other. While many saw Frederick as a disappointment to his father's militaristic vision, Katt embraced him for who he was. The relationship gave Frederick a sense of validation and belonging. It was a bond that carried undertones of deep affection and possibly romance, creating a world within a world where Frederick could truly express himself without fear or judgment, even if only briefly. 6. The friendship between Frederick and Katt carried deep emotional and possibly romantic undertones. Though history cannot fully reconstruct the exact nature of Frederick and Katt's relationship, letters and accounts strongly suggest that their friendship was not ordinary. The emotional intensity between them exceeded the typical camaraderie of the time. Their letters were filled with warmth, intellectual intimacy, and a tone that hinted at more than mere friendship. In a society where Frederick's father scorned softness and tenderness, the closeness between the two young men was radical, even subversive. They found in each other a refuge, a space where vulnerability was allowed. Many historians have argued that this bond carried romantic undertones, possibly making it one of the most important emotional relationships of Frederick's life. Whether physical or not, the connection was profound enough to provoke suspicion at court and the wrath of Frederick William I. To Frederick, it was his personal embodiment of the Greek ideals of passionate male companionship. 7. Their bond mirrored the Greek ideal of intimate male friendship, blending philosophy, affection, and loyalty. Frederick's knowledge of Greek ideals helped him frame his relationship with Katt as something more than a youthful friendship. In ancient Greece, bonds between men were celebrated as avenues of loyalty, education, and love. This cultural background gave Frederick a lens through which to see his connection with Katt as noble rather than shameful. They discussed philosophy, shared dreams, and supported each other emotionally in ways that mirrored the relationships celebrated in classical texts. Their companionship was as much intellectual as it was emotional, a fusion of minds and hearts. This duality made the bond dangerously subversive in the eyes of Frederick's father, who wanted loyalty directed only toward the state and its king. For Frederick, however, it was the closest he had ever come to experiencing the Greek ideal in his own life, a profound blending of affection, intellect, and steadfast loyalty. 8. Frederick and Katt planned to escape Prussia, driven by a longing for freedom from the king's oppressive rule. The suffocating control of Frederick William I eventually became unbearable for Frederick. Constantly humiliated, beaten, and denied freedom, the young prince dreamed of fleeing Prussia altogether. Katt became his partner in this daring fantasy. Together, They planned an escape that would take Frederick to England, where he hoped to live freely and pursue the life his father denied him. The plot involved secrecy, trusted intermediaries, and immense personal risk. To Frederick, this escape was not only about political rebellion but also about personal liberation. It was a chance to leave behind a father who despised him and a system that chained him to a destiny he had not chosen. Kat's willingness to join Frederick was itself an act of deep loyalty and affection. The escape plan symbolized their shared dream of freedom, a Greek adventure of the soul, daring to defy tyranny for the sake of love and liberty. 9. The escape attempt failed, leading to Frederick's arrest and disgrace. The escape plan, however, collapsed before it could succeed. Frederick's father discovered the conspiracy, and the young prince was arrested. The disgrace was immense. A crown prince fleeing his father's realm was seen not merely as disobedience but as treason. Frederick was imprisoned, humiliated, and threatened with execution. For a time, it seemed possible that the young prince's life would end in tragedy before it had truly begun. His father's fury knew no limits, and Frederick was treated with brutal severity. The episode marked the lowest point of his youth, stripping him of dignity and reinforcing the cruel hold of paternal authority. Yet even in failure, the escape attempt symbolized Frederick's desperation for freedom. It showed the depth of his bond with Kat and the intensity of his rebellion against his father's iron grip. The disgrace was public, but the yearning behind it remained deeply personal. 10. Kat was executed by order of Frederick William I, with Frederick forced to watch the beheading. The true tragedy of the failed escape was not Frederick's imprisonment but Kat's fate. Frederick William I, determined to break his son's spirit, ordered that Kat be executed for his part in the plot. In a cruel twist, he forced Frederick to watch the beheading of his closest friend. The young prince fainted at the sight, and the trauma of that moment would scar him for life. Kat's death was more than the loss of a companion, it was the violent destruction of Frederick's most intimate bond. The execution was meant to sever him from rebellion, to crush the Greek dream that had fueled his desires. Instead, it left Frederick haunted by grief and guilt. He never forgot that his father had made him a witness to this horror, and Kat's memory became a hidden wound that shaped his inner life and future rule as king. 11. The trauma of Kat's death left Frederick scarred but also more determined to conceal his inner self. Watching his closest friend executed before his eyes seared Frederick's soul. The grief was unbearable, yet the cruelty of being forced to witness it taught him a dangerous truth. To survive, he must conceal who he truly was. Frederick learned to wear masks, to project obedience and military zeal outwardly while sheltering his private thoughts and desires deep within. The trauma hardened him, but it also sharpened his instinct for secrecy, making him more cautious in matters of the heart. He would continue to pursue philosophy, art, and companionship, but never again with such openness or recklessness. The loss of Kat closed a chapter of youthful idealism, replacing it with guarded calculation. His father's cruelty had silenced the outward expression of his Greek adventure, but inwardly Frederick clung to it even more fiercely, determined that no king, no father, and no enemy would ever rob him of it again. 12. Frederick continued to cultivate classical learning, secretly reading Greek and Roman texts. Though his father demanded strict military training, Frederick found ways to continue feeding his passion for the ancients. He read Homer, Plato, and Cicero in secret, often hiding books in his quarters or smuggling texts with the help of trusted companions. The Greek and Roman classics became his intellectual lifeline, allowing him to escape into worlds where philosophy and beauty held more value than muskets and drilling. He memorized passages, wrote reflections, and engaged in private correspondence with intellectuals who understood his hunger for ideas. For Frederick, these readings were not academic exercises but acts of resistance, proof that he could nurture his inner life despite the surveillance and punishments of his father. This devotion to classical learning cultivated the refined thinker within the reluctant soldier, preparing him for the dual identity he would carry into adulthood, outwardly the warrior king, inwardly the philosopher still dreaming of Greece. 13. He used classical philosophy and poetry as a veil to express forbidden desires in coded language. Frederick's admiration for classical antiquity offered him more than intellectual satisfaction, it provided a shield behind which he could safely explore his emotions. In Greek poetry and philosophy, the theme of love between men was celebrated, if not always explicitly, and Frederick used these references to encode his own feelings. When he wrote poems or letters, his language was often draped in classical allusions, making it difficult for critics to accuse him of impropriety while allowing those who understood the tradition to see his meaning. This veil of antiquity let Frederick express longing, affection, and passion in ways that could otherwise have destroyed his reputation. To the world, he was quoting Plato or echoing Homer. To himself, he was speaking of cat, of love, of desires forbidden by his society. Thus, the Greek lens became both sanctuary and cipher, protecting his secret heart while preserving his dignity as a prince. 14. As king, Frederick built Sanssouci Palace, designed as a cultural haven inspired by Athens rather than Berlin. Years later, when Frederick finally became king, he gave physical form to his inner world through the creation of Sanssouci Palace in Potsdam. Unlike the cold barracks of his father's reign, Sanssouci was envisioned as a retreat of beauty, philosophy, and art. Its very name meant, without care, reflecting Frederick's yearning for a world beyond oppression and duty. The palace gardens and architecture drew inspiration from the classical ideals he had cherished since youth, embodying his dream of a personal Athens. Here he gathered philosophers, artists, and musicians, creating a circle of intellectual companionship that recalled the symposia of ancient Greece. Sanssouci was less a symbol of royal power than of personal freedom, a sanctuary where Frederick could nurture the life his father had once tried to extinguish. It was the ultimate expression of his Greek adventure, transposed into stone, music, and conversation for future generations to see. 15. His reign balanced military genius with an inner life devoted to philosophy, poetry, and music. The paradox of Frederick's character became most evident once he took the throne. On the battlefield, he was every bit the warrior king his father had demanded: brilliant, daring, and ruthless. He maneuvered armies with a precision that astonished Europe, earning victories that secured Prussia's place among great powers. Yet away from the field, Frederick revealed the other side of his nature. He wrote poetry, composed music, and held nightly discussions with philosophers. He corresponded extensively with Voltaire, debating ideas of freedom, governance, and human nature. The king who commanded soldiers by day played the flute by night, weaving sonatas that reflected his inner longing for beauty. This duality was not a contradiction but a synthesis. Frederick demonstrated that one could be both strategist and philosopher, both conqueror and artist. In him, the militarism of Prussia coexisted uneasily with the ideals of ancient Greece, shaping a uniquely complex reign. 16. Frederick's relationships with men continued throughout his life, though discreetly hidden under classical illusions. Though Kat's death taught Frederick the dangers of openness, he did not abandon his longing for companionship. Throughout his life, he maintained close relationships with certain men at court, relationships that bore the same intimacy and intensity as his bond with Kat, though expressed with far greater caution. He entertained trusted favorites, shared private correspondence, and occasionally allowed veiled affection to appear in his writings. Yet always he cloaked these bonds in the respectable garments of classical illusion. References to Plato's dialogues, to Homer's heroes, or to Roman philosophers allowed him to express deep affection without exposing himself to scandal. Those who knew the traditions could read between the lines, others dismissed his writings as merely scholarly. In this way, Frederick managed to sustain the forbidden flame of his youth, keeping alive the Greek adventure of his heart while avoiding the dangers that had once nearly destroyed him. 17. He wrote poetry in French with veiled references to Greek ideals of love and companionship. Frederick's chosen literary language was French, the tongue of sophistication and intellectual discourse in 18th-century Europe. His poetry, often dismissed by critics for its uneven quality, nevertheless reveals much about his inner world. Veiled within lines about philosophy, virtue, and friendship are echoes of Greek ideals, hints of bonds that transcended ordinary companionship. By writing in French and invoking antiquity, Frederick could hide his personal sentiments within a web of cultural legitimacy. His poems often carried undertones of longing and melancholy, reflecting both the memory of Kat and the difficulty of living a double life as king and secret dreamer. Though carefully disguised, the themes of beauty, intimacy, and love between men are unmistakable to modern readers. His poetry, then, was not merely a pastime but a subtle act of confession, a way of giving voice to feelings that remained forbidden in the rigid world of Prussian monarchy. 18. His secret youth explains the paradox of a king who was both a ruthless general and a refined philosopher. Historians have long puzzled over the contradictions in Frederick's personality. How could the same man be Europe's most brilliant general and also its most devoted patron of philosophy? The answer lies in his secret youth. The trauma of his father's tyranny and Kat's death forged in him both ruthlessness and sensitivity. On the battlefield, he became cold, calculating, and disciplined, traits born from surviving an authoritarian father. Yet privately, he never abandoned the Greek ideals that had inspired him since boyhood, clinging to them as a reminder of the freedom he once sought. The result was a paradoxical monarch who embodied both extremes of his age: enlightenment and militarism, philosophy and conquest, repression and longing. His Greek adventure was not erased by adulthood but rather hidden beneath the armor of a king. It explains why Frederick could be both destroyer and dreamer, both conqueror and humanist. 19. Frederick's legacy shows how forbidden passions can shape a leader's vision of art, power, and freedom. The story of Frederick's youth reminds us that private passions can have profound public consequences. His forbidden love for Kat and his fascination with Greece shaped not only his personal character but also his vision of kingship. He championed religious tolerance, patronized the arts, and made philosophy a part of governance, all of which reflected his inner yearning for a freer world. Yet his passions also taught him caution, forcing him to conceal parts of himself while mastering the art of strategy and deception. The very repression that scarred him also honed his political instincts. His legacy, therefore, is one of complexity, a king whose greatness cannot be explained by battles alone but must also be understood through the forbidden longings that shaped his worldview. In Frederick, we see how the private struggles of the heart can ripple outward to influence the fate of nations. 20. His Greek adventure was symbolic, a spiritual and emotional journey into ideals that defied the harshness of his age. Though Frederick never set foot in ancient Greece, his life was profoundly shaped by what Greece symbolized to him. His Greek adventure was not geographical but spiritual, a journey into a world where beauty, philosophy, and love were honored rather than suppressed. It represented his rebellion against the harshness of Prussian militarism and his father's tyranny. In Greece, he found justification for his desires, inspiration for his art, and a vision of freedom that contrasted with the rigid structures of his time. Even as king, he carried this symbolic adventure within him, expressing it in his palaces, his music, and his philosophy. It was both his secret wound and his hidden strength. In the end, Frederick's Greek adventure stands as a metaphor for the timeless struggle between duty and desire, repression and freedom, reminding us that even kings live lives shaped by the passions of their youth.